kind of...
So something that was kind of on my mind in thinking about organizations, thinking about your career, I kind of think of your career or your kind of sociology as being like a Venn diagram with three circles. So social psychology is one part of it, organizational theory, organizational behavior is one part, and then social movements, one part. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it leaves off the most recent, though, the sociology of science.
Yes, that's true.
The
that's
science
true.
as sociology as science and humanities kind of.
Right. No, that's absolutely true.
And of course, I was trained as a social psychologist, and I could have stayed in it. And you could make an argument that the first critical choices were after the dissertation, and the pathway at that point I had a political social psychology interest. So I was thinking about doing a study of white-collar ideology, because C. Wright Mills is still alive and had recently published that book. As a matter of fact, I talked about trying to do that as a dissertation, and Bob Kahn was ready to hire me at ISR, but he didn't actually have the money in hand, and so if they hadn't gotten the money, I would have worked on some other ISR project. And I had a chance to do organizational study, correctional institutions. And so I made that choice to do the money in hand project. Then when I got to Chicago, I had money from the dean. $300 you could buy a graduate student at the time for a summer. And I had this advanced graduate student at Denton, and I told her I had these two things I was thinking about working on that summer. Which would she like to do? And I could go start working on the white collar issue again, or I could do this organizational study of the YMCA. And she chose the YMCA. And that was fateful in terms of my next step. Now, I could have come back again, but I didn't. After that, I was firmly more organizationally oriented. And the interesting thing, of course, is that she was supposed to do that for her doctoral dissertation, and she dropped out of the doctoral program and went on to become a child care worker. So I always get a kick out of that.
So how do you think these parts fit together?
The social psychology?
Social psychology. I mean, it does seem in the book or the study about the YMCA that there's an awful lot of social psychology and behavior. But how do you think the three areas fit together?
I don't think they fit together in my career.
Well, I mean, intellectually.
I use whenever I'm getting into a discussion and somebody's trying to say something about social psychology that I think is wrong, I say, I was trained as a social psychologist. Or they say something that I think is a bad argument. So I would buy into I think the macro stuff, columns and all that, is very useful. And but I've never joined that battle. That's not where I wanted to go. So I ended up not going back to any systematic use of the...
So that basically says put aside social psychology and the theories.
For me, and I'm not hostile to it. In the social movement literature, the feeling that the Zald, McCarthy, and Tilley's stuff all seem to deny emotions in social movements. I don't deny emotions in social movements. I wasn't focusing on it, and I was part of. It's true that our approach is economistic, in terms of its resource mobilization. That's true. But that doesn't mean I don't think there's anything else going on. And so there's a lot of very good work done on emotions. And how you bridge it is an issue. How do you put them together that they're both going on is part of the issue. So for me, I just never... I ended up going to meso. I never really went macro, Collins has been that whole suite, right?
So one thought of my own about organizations, the way I think about organizations, is that they're mid-level social structures that have a fairly specific and reasonably stable structure of rules of behavior and systems of enforcement, so that if you were the rogue mid-level tax bureaucrat, you wouldn't get away with it for very long, because there are other people whose assignment is to make sure that you are audited and that you're behaving correctly, so that there's a kind of homeostasis of the rules where people are assigned to be mentors, trainers, and observers. And so the organization itself has a reasonably stable structure, and that's what gives it causal properties. Does that seem like a description that makes sense to you, or do you think it's a more fluid situation?
Well, there is the informal side of organization, which you could talk about in very social psychological terms. And it's true that in the correctional institution study, the kind of notion of I have end up with an analysis of why it was a study of correctional institutions for delinquents. And you would usually find, even though these places had no fences around them, that the control of the inmates was a key factor. So you could have a superintendent, but it was really having whoever was in charge of security, of managing the housekeepers, of keeping track of the kids, turned out to be had the informal role higher than usually the assistant to the superintendent.
In terms of regulating behavior.
And in terms of other people's view of their influence in the organization.
Oh, that's interesting.
If you ask, I went up, one of our places was at schools we studied. We did 5. We did a West Virginia school that was very custodial. At Menninger in Kansas, where the juvenile thing was staffed by people who had a lot of connection to Menninger, so very psychiatric. I did a place in Detroit called Boys Republic or something. We had 5, but the one in Lansing, they had no fence around, but there's tight, secure movement between buildings, and the building doors were locked once they got into them. And the guy who really dominated was a guy who had a high school degree, or who was kind of chief of the housemasters. That's not what they were called. Basically, that was their role. And they had a psychologist with the psychological service who may have had an MA or a PhD even. He didn't have the power. There was, everybody didn't see him as the most important person. As a matter of fact, in that case, I think they thought that this house guy had more influence than the superintendent, who played more of an outside role, actually.
That's interesting.
So
you remind me
you can do that on power dependence kind of notions, which is social psychological.
Right.